This is the Honda E, which, as the name suggests, is a Honda that is electric. It's a full battery electric vehicle, and it is quite compact as well as being reasonably cute, and perhaps not quite as cute as the original concept. Anyway, 3.9 meters long, it's slightly shorter than a Honda Jazz. It's also a little bit narrower and sits closer to the ground, but sometimes electric vehicles can have advantageous packaging, which means they're quite spacious inside. We'll come to that in a moment. It sits on an all-new platform that is really short. It's got a 35.5 kilowatt hour battery between the wheelbase, which is not loads. It's rear-wheel drive, and there's no room in the front either, because that's where all the inverter and all the other gubbins is. But let's take a look inside and see what it's like in there. Right, so welcome to the inside of the E, where things are quite funky, which will probably be important, I think, because if you look at this car purely on the numbers, its range at about 125, 130 miles isn't spectacular, and its pricing at 26 to 28 grand is quite a lot by the scheme of things. So it is asking a lot of money for a car that will not go as far as others, but Honda says, well, look beyond that, okay? Look at the car as a product. So it mentions smartphones, it mentions Apple Corporation. It's trying to sell you a lovely thing rather than just something you buy on the numbers. And to be fair, it is nice in here. It is pretty cool. There are some kind of cool retro themes, and then also this enormous twin touchscreen at the front, which has lots of functionality. I think it takes a little bit of getting used to. There are also a few gimmicks in it. It's got an HDMI thing, so you could plug in your games console if you wanted to. I don't know why you would. You can get an aquarium up on that screen, which you can look at. I don't sit in my car and look at the screen very often when it's not going anywhere, but you know, whatever. Anyway, it is quite cool, and there are mirrors which have been replaced by cameras as standard, which is a first, I believe, on a production car as standard. And that reduces aerodynamic drag and aerodynamic noise from the mirrors, which is quite cool. But this is not a very spacious car, funkily designed and nicely finished though it is. There's not loads of under-thigh support. There's even less room in the back. But let's give Honda the benefit of the doubt for now. They say it's a cool thing, and also that it's nice to drive. So let's go and find out. And so to the driving of this Honda E, where the weather has taken a little bit of a turn for the worse, as you can see. So first impressions, it's an EV. There's no huge amount of noise normally. I've driven it in conditions that are slightly better than this as well. There's a huge amount of wind gusting and the rain kicking off as well, but in nicer conditions, I can tell you actually it is a very quiet car. As is all the way with an EV, when you don't have so much engine noise, it feels like it amplifies the road and wind noise. I don't think they're excessive. I think this is generally a pretty quiet, smooth cruising car. And what is significant about it, and I think this is probably worth mentioning, it's got its own platform, it's got a rigid shell and four-wheel independent suspension with MacPherson struts all round. And because it's quite compact and because it's got independent suspension, it only weighs like 1,500 kilos, which is a lot for a car of this size, but not a lot for an EV. What that means is I think Honda has been able to tune it to drive actually really rather nicely. It's compliant, it turns reasonably willingly, the steering is really nice and smooth. I mean, it's not a sports car or anything, but it is a pleasant, willing car to drive, and it's got that initial oomph. You can get one in 136 or 150 odd horsepower. This is the 150 odd horsepower version. 0 to 60 takes about 8 seconds, but what it has is it's got that electric motor oomph in that it makes peak torque from 0 RPM, which in this case is 350 Newton meters, which is about 250 pounds-foot in old money. So it's got a really good initial step off and acceleration, and the motor is at the back, which means that it's got very good traction. So it gets going quite quickly. The figure is 0 to 60 in 8 seconds, but as is the way with EVs, it feels quicker than that as you step off of the mark. And it maintains a decent level of performance even as you up the speed, although inevitably, as is the same in an internally combusted car, the faster you go, the less efficient you are, because the more aerodynamic drag you're pulling against. So the driving environment is pretty good. The steering wheel adjusts for reach and brake. It's this sort of big, slightly retro two-spoke job, which I'm actually quite fond of, actually. I rather like that. The driving position itself is quite good, although I do feel a little bit short and under thigh support. And these mirrors, the non-mirror mirror, I'm getting used to more quickly than I thought. What's good about them is that they are almost in the same place as you would find them just next to the window. What they do is they increase visibility just out of the window, but they're also not far inboard. Whereas on the Audi e-tron, which is the only other car I've tried which has them, they're just set far too low. So you go looking where you think they're going to be and they're not there. Here, they're in the right spot. And despite the fact that this weather has been foul all day long, the view in them remains really clear. So I think they have better lighting in dim conditions than a normal mirror sometimes does. They take some getting used to, but I'm not unhappy to find them here. The rest of the display works, well, a mix of reasonably well and reasonably not so well. The instrument pack is fine. The two big screens across here, I think you will find a few things that work for you. Probably just sync it with your phone, won't you? Really? That's what I do. The most easy thing that I use is a smartphone. So you just make that screen like that. Otherwise, it looks a bit sort of Androidy, Windowsy, I think, as a rule. So it's fairly straightforward. There's a personal assistant, which is just Google by voice, as far as I can tell, really, and a load of sub-menus and stuff like that, and I think you'll probably use once and never again. It's fine. Connectivity in a car is a thing that people bang on about, manufacturers bang on about, because they know we're connected all the time, or we like to be connected all the time. There's a limit to how much we can do while we're driving, and if we're not driving, well, we've all got a smartphone or a tablet in which we're much more familiar anyway. So I don't quite understand the continued fascination with connectivity, but there you go, it has a lot of it. As a car then, it's really quite nice. The ride, as I said, is good. The handling is good. Some EVs have this sort of skateboard architecture and they just shudder along and rattle along and they do not ride very well at all. There is nothing about the dynamic character of this car that says to you it's an electric vehicle. Honda says it's benchmarked cars from two classes above, so like Focus class or Mondeo class, what would they call it? Civic class or Accord class, I suppose. And that is actually how comfortable and refined I think it feels on the move, despite having a fairly short wheelbase. And yes, it turns really nicely. It's got a really small turning circle because the motor is at the back and the front wheels turn a lot. So between curbs, the turning diameter is something like 8.5 meters, which is pretty, 8.6 meters, which is probably a good metre and a half less than most super minis. So that's all the good stuff. What is not the good stuff? Well, I've got 90% of my charge left, and it says the range is 117 kilometres, which is, I mean, it's a cold day, and I'm tempted to have the heated steering wheel on even, but that is not a very long way. You can charge this 35.5 kilowatt hour battery at 100 kilowatts, but it doesn't take a huge amount less time than it does charging it at 50 kilowatts. You can do both. I think it's like flying from like Birmingham to Edinburgh. You know, by the time you've ramped up there, it's time to come back down again. So you don't spend any time at that peak cruising speed of 100 kilowatt charging. So 50 kilowatt, 100 kilowatt, you can get 80% of charge into this battery in around half an hour. And if you're doing distances, given the range, that's what you'd have to do. But Honda says, well, look, you know, these people, you know, the majority of the 200 orders they've had, as I speak to you now, a few months before the car's launch, most of them are in and around London. Most of them have short journeys. This is a car that is fine for short journeys. And if you want to make longer journeys, well, maybe this car isn't for you. It's a car for people who like the product. It's a car for people who can have got 300, 350 pounds a month to spend on a nice thing that they like spending time in. And if you drive 10,000 miles a year, well, chances are perhaps this is not the car for you. Honda's okay with that. So giving a verdict is difficult. I was just speaking to the boss of cars for Honda in the UK, and he says, look, our dealers are on board with selling electric vehicles. The company is on board with selling electric vehicles. You know, legislators are on board with selling electric vehicles. It's all fine, and this is the way it is all going, because the minimum CO2 standards that European manufacturers have to hit in 2020, 2021, and will become ever more stringent throughout the next decade. All car manufacturers have to sell electric vehicles. They're all on board with that. But he wasn't sure whether all customers were on board with that. Because if you are going into a dealer and you say, well, I've got a Honda Jazz, it cost me 12 grand and I like it very much and I fill up once a month, then it cost me 35 quid. And now here is a car of the same size, in fact even smaller inside,
much smaller inside. There's no room at the back, the boot is tiny, and there's no room at the front because the inverters are all there. So it's, anyway, fine, it's a small car. So where does that leave the E? Well, there are things that are good about it, and I think they probably get you in here, and there are things that are limited about it, and they strike me in a market that's dominated by range and price. They strike me as things that affect the decisions made up there. What's good is it's fun. It's quite funky, perhaps not as funky as the concept was, but it's quite funky outside and inside. It's enjoyable to drive, it's pleasant to get along with. So if you look at it strictly rationally, I think the E is a bit of a tough sell. But if you look at it emotionally, well then perhaps it is a car that you could rub along with. But what I think you've probably got to do is go with what Honda says. When it says, yeah, it's like a smartphone, it's like an Apple product, it's like a premium fun thing to buy and own and enjoy and like, rather than just an appliance, well, you've kind of got to make that commitment to it. And there are a lot of other EVs around, really good EVs around, that don't ask you to quite make that choice.